Hello, good evening. Thank you very much for allowing me to share my thoughts with you today on material transformations. As Judith just mentioned, I focus on new and emergent materials. In particular, I look at materials from a very small scale up, the scale of molecules. So the nanoscale is very, very small. Just contemplate your fingernails for a second. In this 1 second, your fingernails grew by 1 nanometer. So many products of nanotechnology feature surface criteria that are under 100 nanometers in size. And this is really where a lot of the performance aspects, the criteria that we are really looking at for new solutions are born out of. When you look at the slide that you see here, this is an image of our DNA, something that we all have in our individual cells that is self-assembling. It's the blueprint of our entire being. And those base pairs are only 3 nanometers apart. And this is the scale that I really like to look at when I try and study these new and emergent materials. So a lot of the materials that I'm personally very fond of are actually performing. They're smart materials. They can respond to a variety of different inputs. So there's, for example, thermal differentials. There's electricity, as we have just seen in the previous presentation in the bionic limb, that can actually really change the property of a material and the stiffness of the material. There's, of course, photons of light. We know that from photovoltaic systems, for example, or various chemicals. The material response that we can get out of these materials, they also range really wide, like the inputs do. There are, for example, materials that change viscosity, like the example that we just saw, or they change volume, shape. They can start lighting up in the presence of certain stimuli. They can change color. And all these materials really have sensing capabilities because they can actually really take the environment that they're embedded in, sense, and respond with an output. And of course, this has a huge implication for ubiquitous computing and the digital everywhere that is really washing over our society at large. But at the same time, we can make use of these effects that we get from the materials. So we can actually make them do work for us. They can work as actuators. They can perform in systems that we design. I want to share a number of examples that I have been working on over the years, partially in my office that I run together with Peter Yeadon. Office is called Decker Yeadon, but I'm also going to show some examples of student work, how my students are really taking this material attitude and start studying with this in order to try and find solutions for the constructed environment. This is one of my most favorite materials, still hands down, hasn't changed in a while, carbon nanotubes. They're quite amazing in the properties that they display. They're fantastic thermal conductors. They conduct electricity very well, and they have an enormous strength-to-weight ratio that's quite impressive. So they're incredibly strong. This is a single-wall carbon nanotube, but they also come in multi-walled varieties. And you can imagine that once we start embedding them into systems, into materials, when we really infuse them, like let's say in an epoxy or a resin, we can really increase the strength of this material because this is a way that we can actually harvest this fascinating property, even though the material is so small that it is on the scale of a few nanometers in diameter. They might be very long, several microns in length, but the diameter of the carbon nanotubes is really, really tiny. So some of the researchers that I am very happy to be working with here at NJIT actually work on how they can improve the strength of these new materials. And some of the projects that I have been looking at are trying to find out how these new materials can actually transform architecture. This is an example of the competition that I did together with my partner for the Tokyo Fashion Museum that makes use of this material and in particular looking at its strength-to-weight ratio. So we can have these amazingly light facade panels that can simply be hung from the structure, like a hoop skirt almost. But we can also take advantage of the sensing capabilities that we're actually creating, because we can run a current through this material, and as soon as the current changes, we know that there's a hairline fracture, and then we can actually deal with this fracture, repair it before it becomes a problem for the structural integrity of a building. Now, at the same time, we can also use the carbon nanotubes to deliver an electric charge to very particular areas within the facade system, and we can activate an electrochromic ink, another smart material that changes color in the presence of electricity. So we can actually turn these materials into performative systems, and we don't longer have to content ourselves with seeing materials as something that we use to build walls that shield us from the environment. We can actually really create new systems that, for example, turn our facade systems into media-rich environments. Now, this power that is really born out of interdisciplinary collaboration and really takes a lot of expertise is really afforded to us by the understanding through the very small scale. But we can, a lot more than just looking at the materials at that scale. We can create these new materials. We can give them very specific properties. But what do we do with this newfound power? I think we really don't have to look too far, because the problems that are coming towards us are quite severe, and they can be rather daunting. Just this week, on the 31st, this Monday, the United Nations came out with a new report on climate change that is really painting a very clear picture of what is going to happen in the next decades. And one of the things that the specialists from over 70 countries actually have accumulated in this report is a risk assessment. Of course, we all know that by now, that climate change is closely linked to the carbon output that we create by burning fossil fuels. We know that this is actually creating these temperature anomalies that we have been experiencing probably since the early 70s, but they have been getting more and more severe, and we really saw it this year in particular with a very turbulent winter across the entire globe. So what the report actually does is look at different scenarios. There is, of course, business as usual if we keep on pumping carbon into our atmosphere. But then they're also looking at a number of scenarios that are actually benefiting from ambitious mitigation, for example. And they're really trying to create an analysis of what we can do and what the different factors are and things that we will have to respond to. So, of course, the two things that are the most important in order to keep the risk from climate change down is mitigation, but then also adaptation. Adaptation has already started to happen in many areas of our life, in many cultures. And I think that in architecture, these two words, mitigation and adaptation, are going to be crucial in the next decades. First of all, because we cannot add to the carbon anymore unless we want to have the worst case scenario. It's very clear. And then when we think about that, we're still using around 40% of our energy in buildings, and most of that energy actually does come from fossil fuels. We can see what the responsibility is that is being put on architects, and I think they really have to step up to the challenge and think about new systems. But we can also not forget that we actually have to try and conserve energy at the same time. So it's not all about the energy production, it's also about the conservation of energy. So what I find very interesting, especially when I look towards artificial muscles, very similar to some of the muscles that are being looked at for bionic limbs or constructs, they can create environments that are completely adaptive. So this is an example of a dielectric electroactive polymer. It's a polymer core coated with 2 silver electrodes that are applied to the material in a corrugated manner, and as soon as you apply electricity to the system, the electrodes become attracted to each other and the material elongates in turn. Now, we were designing an actuator that can actually make use of this movement and open and close these leaflets that are embedded in a facade system. The material is extremely light. It's lighter than my scarf and can be simply adhered. And it can be activated at any point to change the shape and either allow or deny solar heat gain into a building. So you can imagine that we can, first of all, block solar heat gain when we don't want it, or we can allow it deep into our rooms when we want it to assist heating systems, for example. But we will definitely save money on cooling costs in summertime. But there's another great aspect to this design, because it can actually guide daylight deep into our buildings, which will help us conserve electricity that we would usually expend on lighting. So these materials, considering how we build and how much glass we use in architecture, are going to be quite instrumental of trying to help us control the environment, adapt to the changing environment, but also help us conserve energy. Now, as I said earlier, there is an electric charge that has to be applied to the material in order to really trigger the transformation. But there are also other materials that work completely without electricity. This is a muscle wire. It's a nickel titanium metal that has a memory programmed into the material. This means that the material is not only the sensor, it's the motor at the same time, and it is also the computing device, because it actually responds to very specific temperatures. So at cold temperatures, what you can see here in this animation, the regular top spring, it's a counter spring, can overcome the force of the shape memory alloy spring, which you see at the bottom, with ease. And then as soon as the temperature rises in the system, the shape memory alloy will be stronger than the bias spring, and you will have this tug of war of these two springs continuously without any fatigue, as long as you don't overstretch or overheat or fatigue the material in any way. You can get millions of cycles out of this material without ever having to expend any more energy, except for changes in ambient room temperature. This is a spring set that was engineered by Japanese material scientists for us in our office at Decker Yeadon, that is really driving a piston in the middle that allows a screen system to be solely operated by temperature. Here you can see the first working prototype that we created and tested over the course of 24 hours in our office in Brooklyn. In the morning you can see the shade is open, the test environment is cool, and as soon as the sun warms up the test environment, the screen closes all by itself. And as I said, no extra energy needed in order to drive that transformation. This is one of the projects that really shows how we can use these materials and build them into the building blocks of our architectures in order to really create these adaptive environments. And this is one of the projects that I took into the studio that I've been teaching in the architecture department here, where the students, in this case Adam Morgan, was looking at a screen system that is solely driven by one wire that you can see at the bottom of the design. And also he was contemplating how these temperature differentials can drive the screen system in order to allow or deny solar heat gain. But these systems can also actually be very useful in order to control ventilation, for example, if you need to have that triggered by certain temperatures. Here you can see a number of examples that my students came up with for adaptive screen systems. And it's really an example where we have to bring this new attitude that we really have to be thinking about environment into the classroom, where the students can learn about these materials hands-on and really start contemplating what it actually means to work with materials that are not static, but that can actually respond to us, or that can respond to our environment. And I think these new and emergent technologies are going to be crucial when we start talking about adaptation for a more climate resilient architecture or cities, or for mitigation, trying to really curb the effects that we're already starting to experience. And these collaborative efforts that will go across many disciplines, I think, are really the key to many solutions that we can find. Thank you very much.